So we've tackled how to go through a work and how to make notes on it. One of the most important things you're going to need to get out of the works as you're making these notes is an appreciation of the different opinions of different historians. So in our second section, we're going to look at how to find out what other people think. The easiest way to do this is to set the book you're reading another question. And that question is, what does the author think about change and what causes change? This question, more than any other, is going to help you identify what the personal biases of the historian that's writing that book are. I'm going to quickly go over some different schools of scholars now, some of the different ways in which historians can be grouped together. My classification is going to be a bit crude due to time limits, but if you want more on this, there's an excellent and very easy to understand Access to History paperback called History and the Historians by John Warren. I recommend you check that out. Firstly, you have the Marxist school of history. This believes that all of history is a series of clashes between different classes of people who have different economic relationships with one another. What causes change is a change in the economic relationship between these different people. So for instance, in the capitalist era, the relationship is between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, between the workers and those who own the means of production, like factory owners, for instance. This relationship, which Marxists define as one of struggle, also largely defines culture and everything else happening in the world. So for Marxists, when the economic relationship in the world changes, everything else changes too, to a huge degree. Now this is in stark contrast to a French school of thought called the Annales school. This school believes that change only happens very slowly, that events that might be very noticeable don't really change things very much. Some Annales historians have used the analogy of events being the foam on the top of a wave, which don't really have any significance, or they're not as long lasting compared to the big currents that occur beneath the foam. So for a Marxist, a revolution would be a tremendous time of change where everything shifts, but for an Annales historian, peasants would continue to gather their crops, families would still nurture their young, life would go on much as it did before. Now, as I said, there are other ways of approaching history, and I would suggest that you have a look at a book like John Warren's work. However, most historians writing today don't tend to follow one particular approach. They might be influenced by the Marxists or whoever, but more often than not, what's important is the type of history that they're writing, whether that's political, whether that's economic, whether that's social or cultural. And often the sources that are used determine the arguments that are made. It's not so much the rate at which change is felt to occur that defines a historian, but what he or she thinks causes that change to take place. What type of historian is writing the book that you've just read? From what I've just said, the answer should be clear. You look at the types of sources that they use. Now, just because that answer's easy doesn't make it untrue. Generally, and when I say generally, I really do mean generally, economic historians tend to look at long-term trends, changes in exports and imports, in the way that a country or a people produces stuff, how that changes over long periods of time. Political historians tend to focus on what elites are saying, the cutthroat world of everyday politics, of scandal, of making laws, and so on. Social historians are, as the name suggests, primarily concerned with societies at large, how societies change in the way that they look, in the way that they experience the world. Cultural historians, again, naturally as the name suggests, look at culture as a means of as a way of getting into an era, into the era in which those cultural works are created. Because of the sources that they're looking at, these different types of history tend to depict change in different ways. So let's take an example. Say we're looking at the growth in literacy in Victorian England. A social historian might argue that changes take place because the masses demand more. You might look at radical reformers such as the Chartists as proof of people power during the Victorian era, say, well, that's the reason why we had these changes, because the people wanted them. A political historian might look at changes in terms of legislation, in terms of the Education Acts that politicians introduced which saw more children going to school. They would look at the individuals concerned in introducing these acts and explain change in terms of what different politicians thought in terms of how they saw the world and in terms of how they were seeking to use that to profit for the benefit of their own careers. An economic historian, however, might argue that these reforms weren't the really important thing. What was really important was that the country was rich enough to be able to afford such reforms. Or they might argue that capitalist employers wanted more people to be literate so that they could do their jobs better. I could go on, but if you try and read works by more than one type of historian, you will more likely than not see different ways in which the topic you're examining can be understood. So, when you have an idea of the sorts of historical problems that there are that need addressing, the next thing is to get on with your primary research. The first thing to do here is to make a list of the primary sources you would hope to be able to use in answering your question. Make a wish list and put these sources, arrange them in descending order in terms of how useful you think they will be to you in answering your question. So, another example, say you were writing about the Indian Mutiny of 1857. For those of you who are not aware of this, basically in 1857, some sections of Indian society rebelled against the British that were in charge. The British were running India through the East India Company. Some Indians, soldiers, peasants, rebelled against the British. Now, if I were trying to answer for my historical inquiry what caused this mutiny, at the top of the list, top of my personal list, I would probably put details of the legislation that the British introduced at the time. So a list of the laws, because I'd want to know the sorts of things that the British did in India. What might they have done to cause Indians to rebel against the British? Then I might put the reports that were made by the British government afterwards, in light of the experience of the mutiny, what the British wrote in terms of trying to come to grips with, trying to understand what had caused the empire to be put under such stress. Then I might want to look at some economic statistics, which looked at how rich or poor Indians were and how much they were taxed. However, people don't always act rationally because of a specific policy or change in the economic landscape. So next, I might put eyewitness accounts of the mutiny, accounts written by both Britons and Indians who were there at the time. Now, you'd have to be aware of the biases involved in using these sources, as in any source that you're going to be using in your historical inquiry, but you could still get away with using these bits of evidence if you were careful. Next down on your list, you might use the diaries or the books written by British people back home as they were getting the news back from India that the mutiny had taken place. Now, this would obviously be less useful in most cases because they weren't created by people with first-hand experience of the mutiny itself, but it might be useful, so it would possibly be worth looking at once you looked at all the other stuff that was above that on your list. It's very important to emphasise that at all times you have to be focused on the question you're trying to answer. Now, that, again, as with everything that I've said today, that might sound very a common sense thing, but you need to bear it in mind because different pieces of evidence have different amounts of importance depending on what you're trying to get out of them. Say that, instead of looking at the causes of the mutiny, I was trying to work out how the mutiny changed British people's opinions of India and of Indians. Now, it's perhaps rather obvious to point it out, but the works written by people who didn't have first-hand experience of India would become more important than all the other things that I put down on my first list. Sources like the legislation the British produced might be helpful in one way, incidentally, but it's going to be those diaries, those books that I mentioned, that would become far more prominent. You'd bump them up your list. Okay, so in my last section today, I want to spend some time on the writing. I'm going to look at three things. Firstly, how to structure your work. Secondly, to emphasise the importance to you of critiquing the ideas of others. And lastly, the importance of footnotes. It's very important to work out the structure of your historical inquiry before you start writing. That way you can avoid repeating yourself and avoid wasting words. If you were to use up a lot of words repeating what you've already said, it's a surefire way that you're going to get penalised by the examiner as proof of the fact that you are unable to express yourself clearly and concisely.